Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I remember the way my mother's face twisted in disgust as she threw my suitcase at me, her lips curled into something between anger and satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, his jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes as if I were nothing more than a stain on his reputation. And Melanie, my perfect older sister, stood at the top of the staircase, her arms folded, a small smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, triumphant in a way that made my stomach churn with both rage and devastation. "You're a disgrace," my mother spat, her voice shaking, though whether from anger or something else, I couldn't tell. "You will not drag this family down with your filth. Take your things and get out of my house. You're no daughter of mine." I stood frozen in the entryway, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Just an hour ago, I had been in my bedroom, studying for an exam, blissfully unaware that my entire world was about to be ripped apart by a lie so cruel, so calculated, that it still didn't feel real. "Mom, please," I begged, my voice breaking as I stepped forward, only to have my father lift a hand, stopping me in my tracks. "I don't know what she told you, but I swear to God, I'm not enough," my father interrupted, his voice like a sharp blade slicing through my desperation. "Melanie told us everything. We know what kind of girl you are. We know what you've been doing behind our backs, sneaking around, selling God knows what, bringing shame to this family." I turned sharply to my sister, my vision blurring with a mix of fury and disbelief, but she didn't flinch under my gaze. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if daring me to challenge her, knowing full well that it wouldn't matter what I said. They had already made up their minds. "Melanie," I whispered, my throat tight, my hands trembling at my sides. "Why are you doing this?" "You know I would never." She let out a soft, almost pitying laugh, shaking her head as though I was too stupid to understand what was happening. "Olivia, you've always been reckless, always thinking you're so much better than the rest of us. But actions have consequences. Maybe it's time you finally learn that." I wanted to scream, wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she admitted the truth, until she told them that none of it was real, that she had fabricated everything. But I could see the resolve in my parents' faces, the way my mother's lips curled in disgust, the way my father wouldn't even look at me, and I knew it was already too late. "I swear I've never." "You think we're stupid?" my mother snapped, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. "You think we don't know what kind of girl you are? Dressing like that, sneaking out at night, always running around with those trashy friends of yours? And now we find out you're selling drugs, throwing yourself at men like some common whore." My breath hitched, and my whole body went cold. "That's not true," I choked out, shaking my head violently. "You know that's not true. I don't even drink, for God's sake. I go to school, I study, I don't want to hear it," my father said, his voice like stone, final and unyielding. "Pack your things and go." For a moment, I thought I might pass out, my legs suddenly feeling weak beneath me, my entire body trembling with the weight of what was happening. "Where am I supposed to go?" I whispered, my voice so small I barely recognized it. "I don't care," my mother said flatly, arms crossed over her chest. "You made your choices. Live with them." Melanie turned on her heel, heading up the stairs, her victory secured, and I stood there, watching as my life crumbled into dust beneath my feet. I don't even remember walking out the door. I don't remember how long I stood on the porch, gripping the handle of my worn-out suitcase, staring at the front door of the house I had lived in my entire life, the house that was no longer mine. All I remember is the way the cold wind bit at my skin, the way the sky was turning dark, and the realization that I had nowhere to go. My parents had disowned me, all because of one lie. My sister had destroyed my life, and I still had no idea why. I walked. I don't know how far or for how long, but I walked, my mind spinning, my heart breaking, every step feeling heavier than the last. I had no money, no plan, nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and the sickening weight of betrayal pressing against my chest. The rain started a little after midnight, cold and relentless, soaking through my thin sweater, making my bones ache. I sat on the curb outside a gas station, watching cars pass by, wondering if I should try calling someone, but I already knew the answer. Who would believe me now? Who would care? Melanie had taken everything from me, my home, my family, my future. And as I sat there, shivering, drenched, staring at the headlights streaking by, I realized something else. She had won. For now. But one day, somehow, I would make sure she paid for what she had done. What does a girl do when her own family betrays her? I had no idea. But I was about to find out. The first night on the streets was colder than I expected, and the biting wind cut through my sweater like a knife, leaving me shivering so violently that my teeth clattered together in the silence of the deserted sidewalk. I had never been truly alone before, never had to think about where I would sleep or where my next meal would come from, but as I sat on the curb outside a 24-hour gas station, my arms wrapped tightly around my knees, I understood with a sickening certainty that no one was coming to save me. I thought about calling someone, an old friend, a teacher, maybe even a distant relative, but the weight of shame pressed against my chest, suffocating and unbearable, reminding me that I had nothing left to offer, no story that anyone would believe. No explanation that would make sense to people who had already decided who I was. I spent the first night huddled under the awning of a closed bookstore, my suitcase wedged between my knees as a pathetic barrier against the wind, my stomach aching with hunger, my mind racing through every possible scenario, none of them leading to anything but more misery. By the time the sun started to rise, staining the sky with streaks of pink and orange, my body felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, exhaustion pressing down on me like an anchor, but I forced myself to keep moving, knowing instinctively that looking weak in a place like this would only make me a target. I walked aimlessly through the city streets, avoiding eye contact, keeping my head down, counting the change in my pocket over and over again as if staring at those few coins would somehow make them multiply into enough for a meal, or at the very least, a cup of coffee. Hunger gnawed at me like an animal, turning my stomach into a hollow, twisting pit, and by the time I reached a small diner tucked between two rundown buildings, I was desperate enough to push open the door, despite knowing I had no money to spend. The smell of coffee and bacon hit me like a punch to the gut, and my legs wobbled slightly as I stepped inside, my fingers gripping the strap of my suitcase so tightly that my knuckles ached. I wasn't sure what my plan was, but I knew I couldn't keep walking forever, couldn't keep pretending that my body wasn't screaming for food, couldn't keep ignoring the dizziness creeping into the edges of my vision. The woman behind the counter was older, with deep lines around her mouth and tired eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and when her gaze landed on me, I saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe, or something close to it. I shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, my stomach twisting with embarrassment, but before I could turn and leave, she sighed and grabbed a plate from the counter, setting it in front of me without a word. My throat tightened as I stared at the steaming eggs and toast, the simple meal looking like a feast to someone who hadn't eaten in over a day, and when I finally met her eyes again, she just shook her head, as if to tell me not to argue. "Eat first," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind, and I didn't hesitate before picking up the fork, my hands shaking as I shoveled food into my mouth, barely able to stop myself from inhaling it all in seconds. She watched me in silence, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate movements, waiting until I had finished every last crumb before she finally spoke again. "You got somewhere to go?" she asked, and I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the empty coffee cup, knowing that whatever I said next could determine whether I spent another night shivering on the streets or if I had, by some miracle, found a lifeline. I shook my head, unable to trust my voice, and she sighed again, her fingers tapping against the counter as she studied me, weighing her options, deciding whether I was worth the risk. "I don't got much," she finally said, glancing toward the back of the diner. "But I got a couch in the office, and I could use an extra set of hands around here. It ain't glamorous, and it sure as hell don't pay much, but it's better than nothing." Relief crashed over me so suddenly that I almost felt lightheaded, and I nodded quickly, swallowing against the lump in my throat, barely able to believe that a stranger was offering me more kindness than my own family ever had. "Thank you," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate but all I had to give, and she waved me off, already turning back toward the kitchen, as if taking in stray girls with nowhere to go was just part of her daily routine. Her name was Grace, and over the next few months, she became the closest thing to family I had ever known, her gruff kindness the only thing that kept me from falling apart completely. I worked at the diner every day, scrubbing dishes and wiping down tables, slowly saving every dollar I could until I had enough to enroll in night classes, determined to claw my way out of the hole my sister had thrown me into. I studied in the back office after my shifts, exhaustion a constant weight on my shoulders, but I refused to give up, refused to let Melanie win, refused to let my parents' betrayal define the rest of my life. Late at night, when the diner was quiet and the world felt a little less cruel, I would scroll through social media, my fingers hovering over the pictures of my family, my stomach twisting at the sight of Melanie's perfect life, her perfect smile, her perfect little world that she had built on the ashes of mine. My parents still doted on her, still treated her like their golden child, still posted pictures of family dinners and vacations as if I had never existed, as if the past 19 years had been nothing more than a bad dream that they had finally woken up from. But as I stared at those pictures, my anger no longer burned with the same raw, desperate intensity that it had before. Instead, it settled into something colder, something sharper, something that made my chest feel tight with the weight of inevitability. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and I was willing to wait as long as it took to make them regret ever throwing me away. Years passed, though I counted them not by birthdays or holidays, but by milestones, small victories that marked my slow, deliberate climb out of the hole my family had buried me in. The girl who had once shivered on a curb with an empty stomach and nowhere to go was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned the art of survival, of reinvention, of carefully constructing a future that no one could take from her. I worked endlessly, pouring every ounce of energy into my studies, balancing long hours at the diner with night classes, refusing to let exhaustion drag me under, refusing to let the past weigh me down more than it already had. When I finally walked across the stage to receive my business degree, my heart pounded with something more potent than pride, something closer to defiance, a silent scream into the void that I had made it despite everything, despite them, despite the lies that had been told to break me. The first thing I did after graduation was change my name, severing the last legal tie to the family that had abandoned me, shedding the weight of their betrayal like dead skin that had long since rotted away. I chose something simple, something that held no connection to the girl I had once been, something that made it impossible for them to ever track me down unless I wanted them to. The name Olivia Carter became a symbol of everything I had built with my own hands, every painful step toward the future I had carved from the wreckage of my past, a name that belonged to no one but me. I started my event planning company with nothing but a few $100s in savings, a laptop I had bought secondhand, and an obsessive determination to prove that I could build something real, something lasting, something powerful. I spent months working out of coffee shops and libraries, surviving on caffeine and ambition, fighting for every client, every contract, every opportunity that would push me forward. I had no safety net, no wealthy family to fall back on, no one to soften the blows when things went wrong, but I had something far more valuable than any of that. I had the knowledge that I had already survived worse. Failure was not an option, because failure meant proving them right, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. While I built my empire from the ground up, I kept an eye on Melanie from a distance, my curiosity morphing into something darker, something more calculated as I watched the cracks in her perfect life begin to show. The woman who had once worn her cruelty like a badge of honor was no longer untouchable, no longer shielded by the unwavering adoration of our parents, no longer the golden child who could do no wrong. She had married a man who, by all appearances, should have given her the life she had always wanted: wealth, status, power, but behind closed doors, the story was not quite so perfect. Whispers of infidelity, of financial troubles, of screaming matches behind the gates of their pristine suburban mansion began to surface, and I listened carefully, filing away every detail, every weakness, every opportunity to make her life just a little bit harder. Revenge, I had learned, was not about anger or reckless outbursts. It was about patience, about strategy, about making sure every move was calculated, every strike delivered at the exact right moment. I started small, pulling strings from the shadows, ensuring that certain business deals fell through, that certain rumors found their way into the right ears, that certain people suddenly found Melanie to be far less reliable than she once seemed. She had always relied on charm and manipulation to get her way, but when things started crumbling around her, when the safety net she had always taken for granted began to unravel, she had no idea who to blame. During this time, I met Ethan, a man who had no idea that the woman he was falling in love with had spent years silently orchestrating the downfall of the sister who had ruined her life. He saw me as I wanted to be seen strong, independent, successful, unburdened by the weight of my past, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I could have something real, something untouched by the scars I carried. He loved me without conditions, without judgment, without the cold indifference I had grown used to, and when he proposed, I said yes, not because I needed him, but because I wanted him, because he was the only thing in my life that had not been built from bitterness and vengeance. But even as I planned my wedding, even as I let myself believe in a future where I was not defined by the pain of my past, I could not ignore the unfinished business that still lingered between me and the sister who had stolen everything from me. One night, as I sat alone in my office, watching the latest headlines about Melanie's failing marriage, about the quiet desperation seeping into the edges of her once perfect world, I picked up my phone and typed out a single message from an anonymous number. My fingers steady, my heartbeat slow and controlled. Karma always finds its way home. I hit send, picturing the way her face would pale, the way she would sit up in bed, her stomach twisting with the unmistakable sense that something was coming for her, something she could not escape. Does Melanie know who is behind her sudden misfortunes? Maybe not yet, but she would. Soon. Planning my wedding felt like constructing the final piece of a life I had spent years carefully rebuilding, brick by brick, ensuring that every detail was crafted exactly as I wanted, untouched by the ghosts of my past. Ethan and I had chosen a venue overlooking the ocean, a place where the horizon stretched endlessly, a fitting symbol of the future I had fought so hard to claim as my own. The guest list was filled with people who had stood by me, people who had become my real family, people who knew me not as the girl who had been cast out, but as the woman who had risen from the ashes of that betrayal. There were no invitations sent to the people who had shared my blood, but not my loyalty, no names scrawled on envelopes that would ever reach the doorstep of my parents' house, no expectation that anyone from my former life would have a place in the world I had built for myself. But despite every effort I had made to erase her from my existence, I could not resist the temptation to ensure that Melanie, of all people, knew exactly how far I had come, how much I had thrived despite the destruction she had left in her wake. I had debated for weeks whether or not to send the invitation, knowing that it was not truly an invitation at all, but a carefully laid trap, a subtle yet undeniable way to remind her that she had not won, that she had failed to break me, that I had risen higher than she ever could have imagined. In the end, I addressed the envelope by hand, sliding the crisp card inside, knowing that she would open it with curiosity before realizing, with a sharp twist of resentment, that she had not been invited as a guest, but as a spectator to my triumph. It did not take long for her to respond, though not in the way I had expected, because 2 weeks later, she arrived unannounced at my bridal shower, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the restaurant, her presence as unwelcome as the memories she dragged in with her. The room fell silent the moment she stepped inside, every eye turning toward her as if sensing the storm she carried beneath her perfectly styled exterior, but I did not move from my seat, did not flinch, did not allow even a flicker of surprise to cross my face. I had anticipated something like this, had known that she would never let something as simple as being unwanted keep her from forcing herself into spaces where she did not belong. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp as she reached my side, her nails digging into the back of the empty chair beside me, her fury barely concealed beneath the polished veneer she wore so well. "Are you trying to humiliate me, Olivia? Are you that desperate to make yourself feel important?" I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the bubbles linger on my tongue, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough to make her squirm, before setting my glass down and tilting my head slightly, feigning innocence in a way that I knew would only make her angrier. "I'm not sure what you mean, Melanie," I said, my voice smooth, controlled, deliberately devoid of the anger that still simmered beneath my skin after all these years. "If you received an invitation, it must have been a mistake. I wouldn't have expected you to care about my wedding, given how busy you must be these days." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to desperation, and I knew then that the rumors I had heard were true, that her life was not the perfect picture she had always painted, that her marriage was unraveling at the seams, that the cracks in her carefully constructed world were beginning to spread faster than she could cover them. "You don't get to interfere in my life," she spat, her voice shaking with barely restrained rage, her fingers gripping the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "You don't get to sit here, pretending like you're better than me, pretending like you're some kind of success story while you go out of your way to tear me down." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head as I leaned back in my chair, studying her with the same detached curiosity that one might have for an insect struggling beneath a glass. "I don't have to tear you down, Melanie," I said, my voice light, almost amused. "You're doing that all by yourself. And for the record, I don't have to pretend to be better than you. I just am." The words landed exactly as I had intended, striking something deep within her, because for the first time in her life, she had nothing to throw back at me, nothing to use against me, nothing to hold over my head the way she always had before. I could see the moment she realized it, the moment she understood that I was no longer the girl she had so easily destroyed, no longer the sister she had cast aside without a second thought, no longer someone she could manipulate or control. I had built something for myself, something real, something untouchable, and she hated it more than anything. Before she turned to leave, she leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper, her breath hot against my skin as she delivered her final warning, the last desperate attempt to rattle me, to remind me that no matter how far I had come, I would never truly be free of what she had done to me. "You may have rebuilt your life," she murmured, her words slow, deliberate, filled with something that sounded almost like pity, "but you'll never escape the past." I watched as she walked away, her shoulders stiff, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for the first time in years, I felt nothing but satisfaction, nothing but the quiet certainty that she was wrong, that the past no longer held the power to define me, that I had already escaped it in every way that mattered. But when my phone buzzed the morning of my wedding, a message from an unknown number lighting up the screen, my breath caught in my throat, my fingers suddenly unsteady as I read the words staring back at me, words that sent an unexpected chill down my spine. "We need to talk. There's something you don't know." The sender was my father. And in that moment, I realized that maybe Melanie had been right after all. The morning of my wedding should have been the happiest day of my life, a day filled with nothing but excitement and anticipation, a day where I stood on the threshold of a future I had built for myself with my own two hands, free from the past that had tried so hard to break me. Instead, I sat frozen at the edge of my bed, my wedding dress hanging on the door like a ghost watching over me, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, my stomach twisting into painful knots as I read and reread the message that had just shattered the illusion of my peace. The words were simple, direct, almost clinical in their delivery, but they carried the weight of something so much bigger, something that made my blood run cold and my heart pound in my chest, something that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew. "We need to talk. There's something you don't know about that night." It wasn't all Melanie's fault. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around the device as my mind raced through 1,000 different possibilities, each one worse than the last, each one sending a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me as I tried to make sense of what I was reading. My father had not spoken to me in years, had not reached out, had not offered a single word of apology, of regret, of anything resembling acknowledgement that I still existed. And now, after all this time, he had the audacity to send me a message on the most important day of my life, hinting at some buried truth that I had spent years trying to forget. As if he could simply drop a bomb into my world and expect me to come running back to him, desperate for answers. I wanted to ignore it, wanted to throw my phone across the room, wanted to pretend that none of it mattered, that whatever he had to say was irrelevant, that the past had no power over me anymore. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the words clung to me like thorns, sharp and relentless, tearing at the edges of my resolve, whispering that there was still more to the story. That the betrayal I had carried for so long was not as simple as I had believed it to be. Not all Melanie's fault. Then whose fault was it? My hands trembled as I hovered over the call button, my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts as I tried to convince myself that this was a mistake, that nothing he could say would change what had already happened, that I owed him nothing after all these years of silence. But curiosity was a dangerous thing, and no matter how much I wanted to believe that I was stronger than the past, I knew deep down that I would never truly be free until I knew the truth. The line rang twice before he picked up, his voice rough with age but unmistakable, a sound I had once craved desperately but now sent a shiver down my spine, a voice that no longer held the authority it once had over me. "Olivia," he said, my name heavy on his tongue, filled with something I couldn't quite place, something that made my chest tighten with the weight of memories I had spent years trying to bury. "I wasn't sure you would call." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my voice steady, to keep the anger and hurt locked tightly behind the walls I had spent so long constructing. "You have 30 seconds, I said, my tone cold, unyielding, refusing to give him the satisfaction of knowing just how much he had already shaken me. "Tell me what you need to say, and then lose my number." He sighed, the sound heavy with something that almost sounded like regret, but I wasn't naive enough to believe it was real, wasn't foolish enough to think that a single conversation could undo years of cruelty and abandonment. "That night," he said, his voice quieter now, measured, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just Melanie's lie that got you thrown out. There was more to it than that. More than you ever knew." My grip on the phone tightened, my nails digging into my palm, but I didn't speak, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing that his words had struck something deep inside me. I had spent years believing that Melanie had been the sole architect of my downfall, that her jealousy, her cruelty, her need to destroy me had been the only reason my life had been ripped away from me. And now, my father was telling me that there had been more, that I had spent all these years hating the wrong person, that the betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined. "Mom knew," he continued, his voice laced with something close to shame, something I had never expected to hear from him. "She knew the truth, Olivia. She knew you weren't guilty of anything. She knew Melanie lied, but she let it happen anyway. She forced Melanie to do it." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe, forgot how to think, forgot how to exist in a world where my own mother, the woman who had carried me, raised me, kissed my scraped knees, had knowingly thrown me to the wolves, had looked me in the eyes and cast me aside without hesitation. My head spun, my vision blurred, my body suddenly feeling too heavy, too light, too unsteady as the walls around me seemed to tilt and sway. "Why?" I whispered, the word barely more than a breath, barely more than a broken plea, my voice shaking as I struggled to comprehend the depth of the betrayal that had been hidden beneath the surface all these years. "She found out something about me," he admitted, his voice hoarse, as if the confession itself was physically painful for him to say. "Something that could have destroyed our family, something that could have ruined everything. I don't know how she found out, but she did, and she needed a distraction. She needed something big enough, shocking enough, devastating enough to shift the focus away from the truth. And you, Olivia, You were the easiest target. A sharp, hollow laugh escaped my lips, bitter and humorless, the sound of a woman who had just realized that her entire life had been a lie, that she had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she had never even known she was playing. So, what? I said, my voice ice, my heart pounding furiously in my chest. She sacrificed me to save you? There was a long pause, the silence stretching between us like a chasm too wide to ever be crossed. Yes, he finally admitted, the single word sealing something inside me, hardening something that could never be softened again. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen, the call still connected, his voice still there, waiting, expecting something from me that I would never be able to give. Without another word, I ended the call, the silence that followed heavier than anything he could have ever said. My own mother had orchestrated it all. But why? I never expected to find myself standing outside my parents' house again, the place where I had been cast out like garbage, the place where I had begged and pleaded for them to believe me, the place that had once held every childhood memory I had ever cherished, but had long since turned into nothing more than a graveyard for a girl who no longer existed. The weight of the years pressed down on me as I walked up the front steps, my heels clicking against the wooden porch, my breath steady despite the storm raging inside me, my fingers curling into fists at my sides as I prepared myself for the moment I had spent so many years avoiding. This was not about forgiveness, was not about finding closure or seeking reconciliation, was not about proving anything to people who had never deserved my love in the first place. This was about taking back the final piece of myself that they had stolen, about standing face to face with the woman who had destroyed me and finally, irrevocably, severing the last tie that bound me to her. The door swung open before I even had the chance to knock, and there she stood, my mother, just as cold and immovable as I remembered, her face betraying not a single ounce of surprise, as if she had been expecting me, as if she had known that no matter how far I had run, no matter how many years had passed, I would eventually come back looking for answers. Her eyes swept over me with calculated precision, taking in the expensive coat draped over my shoulders, the designer heels on my feet, the confidence in my posture that had not existed the last time we had stood face to face. If she was impressed, she didn't show it. If she regretted anything, she didn't say so. She simply stepped aside, wordlessly inviting me into a house that no longer felt like home, into a space that had been mine once, but now felt as foreign as a stranger's embrace. I did not waste time on pleasantries, did not allow myself the weakness of hesitation, did not let the lingering remnants of childhood longing soften the steel in my spine. Why? I demanded, my voice steady despite the rawness in my throat, despite the ache in my chest, despite the years of questions that had been reduced to a single, unforgiving word. Why did you do it? Why was I the one you threw away? She closed the door with slow, deliberate movements, as if giving herself a moment to collect her thoughts, though something told me she had rehearsed this conversation in her head long before I had ever decided to show up. When she turned back to face me, there was no sadness in her eyes, no regret, no flicker of motherly affection that I might have foolishly hoped for in another life. There was only calculation, only cold, unyielding certainty, only the brutal honesty of a woman who had never been capable of love in the way that a mother was supposed to be. You were always the expendable one, she said simply, as if those words were not daggers plunged into my chest, as if they were nothing more than a statement of fact, as if the weight of those syllables had not already rewritten every memory I had ever held of her. You were reckless, unpredictable, difficult to control. Melanie understood the rules, understood what was expected of her, understood how to keep her mouth shut when it mattered. But you? You always had to challenge everything, always had to push, always had to question things that weren't meant to be questioned. And when the time came to choose between keeping this family intact or letting you destroy it, the decision wasn't difficult. I stared at her, waiting for the guilt to crack through the surface, waiting for even the slightest indication that she regretted the choice she had made, waiting for something, anything, to prove that there had ever been a moment where she had hesitated before condemning me to a life I had never deserved. But there was nothing. No remorse. No second thoughts. No softness in her gaze, no trembling in her hands, no weight in her words. She had destroyed me without a second thought, and now she stood before me, unrepentant, unmoved, unshaken by the years of suffering she had inflicted. I let out a slow breath, steadying the fire burning beneath my skin, swallowing the urge to scream, to lash out, to demand something from a woman who had nothing left to give me. And in that moment, I realized something so painfully clear, something so freeing that it nearly brought me to my knees. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need to drag her through the mud, didn't need to make her suffer, didn't need to waste another second of my life trying to make her see me, to make her regret, to make her anything other than what she was. Because I had already won. My success, my happiness, my survival, those were the only weapons I needed, the only revenge that mattered, the only proof that I had been stronger than she had ever expected me to be. I stepped back, shaking my head, a small, humorless smile tugging at the corners of my lips as I met her gaze one last time. "You're right," I said, my voice calm, steady, devoid of the bitterness that had once consumed me. "You made your choice. And I made mine. But the difference between us is that I get to live with mine. You have to live with yours." I turned without another word, walking out of that house for the last time, walking away from the past that had haunted me for so long, walking toward the life I had built from the ruins of everything she had tried to destroy. The wedding was perfect, not because of the flowers or the dress or the venue, but because for the first time in my life, I stood surrounded by people who truly loved me, people who had chosen me not out of obligation but out of real, genuine affection. As I danced with Ethan, his hands warm against my back, his eyes filled with nothing but love, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a single message lighting up the screen. "I hate you." Melanie's final words, her last desperate attempt to claw at something she no longer had control over, her final acknowledgement that she had lost the war she had started all those years ago. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in, letting the past finally settle where it belonged. Then I smirked, pressed delete, and slipped my phone back into my pocket. And just like that, I erased them from my life. For good this time.